Hi, this time I wanted to talk about how Final Fantasy XI has influenced my style of running tabletop role playing games in a certain way, in a couple of ways actually. Maybe there are more ways in which Final Fantasy XI has influenced my style of running things, but right now I'm thinking of two ways that could be potentially interesting. In this video, I'm going to reminisce somewhat more about my Final Fantasy XI experience. If you haven't seen my video where I talked about my overall experience with MMORPGs, starting with Final Fantasy XI, I'm going to put the link in the description below and other links related to that. I'm also going to put a link to my review of the box set that serves as an introduction for the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game, because that review contains my information on my beginning, on my start, on my less than optimal or favorable start in tabletop role-playing games. Because I will be talking about that in this video as well, not all of that, but some details. So it could be of interest for you to watch that before, so you can get a better framework of this particular video. Okay, so let's start. When I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons specifically, I got introduced to it. I learned the rules entirely based on the box set. Because as you may remember that I mentioned in that video, when I participated as a player for the first time, the Dungeon Master didn't know what he was doing. So when I got a bit more into Dungeons and Dragons, I didn't have a clear example on how to run overland or exploration type of adventures when you try to move from a particular town or city to an adventure site, a dungeon, haunted castle, etc. So I didn't have a clear example, and that's because in the introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons box set, they just present to you the adventure sites and they almost like skip through the entire journey. And I think those were missed opportunities. They could have introduced some basic rules or details concerning weather, any sort of environment that you could experience or move through when you were moving from one site to another. It felt almost a little bit video gamey, but on those particular video games where there is this overland map and you just click to a particular site and your character walks to that area, almost instantaneously teleports to that area. And there are so many encounters that could have happened in the journey between one point to the other. But in the box set for AD&D, there was none of that. They could have added some encounters when you moved from the village of Freedale, if I'm not mistaken, to Bone Gnasher's domain. And then when you reach the haunted mansion, the dungeon that was sort of like a tribute to the Undermountain dungeon, there were many ways in which they could have had some encounters in forests and valleys and mountains, but they just skipped through that, so I had no clear example. Because many of you, those of you that are knowledgeable in old school type of RPGs and old school Renaissance type perhaps, you already know how to run sandbox type of games, but I had no idea how to do that back then, more than 20 years ago. And I also didn't have a clear example on availability of weapons and armor and gear, because in the starting down of the introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons box set, you had all of the items available, all of the weapons, all of the armor was available in that town. So I also didn't know much about building a list of available items and gear in a particular town, city, village. And Final Fantasy XI helped me realize all of the adventure opportunities concerning that. I'm going to start talking about how Final Fantasy XI influenced the way that I handle item selection or gear selection when characters first arrive at a particular city, town, village, etc. In Final Fantasy XI, the non-player character shops have the worst gear available. This is to encourage players to create, fashion all sorts of pieces of armor and weapons, and so that they sell this gear at the auction house for pretty hefty prices. You really have to work your way up in building up your character, purchasing armor, weapons, etc., accessories. And so when I first started playing Final Fantasy XI, because I was a complete rookie when it comes to MMORPGs back then, I was so adjusted or accustomed to playing role-playing games as your typical single-player Japanese RPG, in which even if you have somewhat of a subpar gear, as long as you grind a lot and you level up significantly, sometimes you can make up for your crappy gear. You could have just a few good pieces of armor or maybe a decent weapon, but not the best, and because you level up so much and you have access to spells and abilities, etc., sometimes you can fight your way through many situations. Although it's always preferable if you have geared up completely before tackling a very difficult dungeon in single-player video game RPGs. But in Final Fantasy XI, there was simply no way for you to effectively move up the levels, that is, moving from one dangerous area to the other, progressively more dangerous and lethal, because some enemies, if you didn't have the appropriate armor, they could finish you off in perhaps 3 or 4 blows. So I remember the first time that I arrived at this area of dunes, Valcorum Dunes, if I'm not mistaken, was the name, the beach area. That was a big stepping point, because before that you could go up, you could solo most of the levels and complete some quests on your own with subpar gear. So I got into the idea that you could keep going in the game without optimizing your character to the fullest. So I remember that I arrived at the dunes, and suddenly I was a warrior, and another warrior took a look at my character, and he was like, "Oh man, you look practically naked," because of the low protection that I had. So I had to go back, and in the second part of this video, that is later on in this video, I'm going to talk a bit more about the journeys of the difficulties of getting from one place to the other. And so this player was like, "Oh no, you need to get something better. You're going to die immediately here in the dunes," because I had not yet fought against any of the monsters in the dunes. So I didn't know how much damage they could deal. And yes, they could kill my character in like about 3 or 4 blows. So I had to go back, all the way back to the Kingdom of Sandoria, the starting area, to mine some things, if I'm not mistaken, sell some gear, and that is my old gear, get some drops, some crystals. If you were not too advanced in your crafting ability, you could also sell crystals and ore that you found in some caverns nearby, and eventually geared up and went back. So I really came to appreciate each piece of equipment, because you have to work so hard for it. So it was like that at almost every level. You had sometimes to pause your routine of fighting enemies in groups. That is, you had your party, and usually, as I mentioned in my video of my first MMORPG experience, that you had to gang up on all these little monsters to get more experience. Sometimes you had to stop doing that for a moment to go and craft some things and gather some materials and sell all of that at the auction house, so you could get better gear, better weapons, etc. And if you wanted a magical, or let's say sort of like a masterwork type of gear, it was incredibly expensive. It was for the casual player, it was out of reach, almost optional, although there were some hardcore players that did not attempt to keep on leveling unless they had all of their good gear with the +1 bonuses and such. You usually had to settle for normal equipment. So it really, I really got to treasure those mundane pieces of armor and weapons, because they took so much hours to get. And so this, I translated or took this to my AD&D adventures and campaigns later on. Before that, I handed the player's handbook to my players, and I said, in this town or this city, everything is available, everything. So they always had a way to get their hands on pretty much anything, even firearms. I think that was included in the Game Master's Guide, if I'm not mistaken. A single an arquebus. But then I got it got me thinking that adventures could be a lot more interesting if you limited the item selection or gear selection. So in other adventures, I only gave them like a limited list, because sometimes the town, it was related to the specific economical situation of the town. Sometimes the town or village could not afford to have a lot of advanced things. It was not a, perhaps it was too far away, for example, from a city, or they had been there had been trouble with the town had some trouble with bandits. But there was always some reason as to why that plate armor that you wanted, or that two-handed sword, was not available in town. You needed to buy a short sword or leather armor, and this gave a lot of opportunities for adventures. Also, it allowed you to make some lower level dungeons more dangerous, because now the player characters started to play, and if, for example, maybe you were a bit more generous and they could only purchase chainmail, they had to be thinking maybe they wanted to go into this the tower of the forgotten red mage or something, and they were not sure if they could take on the enemies that they could find in the tower or the challenges. So they could decide to try to play it really smart and risk it all by going to that tower without being fully equipped or with subpar equipment. They had to strategize quite a lot to create ambushes and to be quite perceptive and observant of the different encounters, not getting into things that they could possibly not take on because of their less than favorable gear. But they could also decide, no, we really need some decent pieces of armor and weapons. But then maybe they talked to the mayor, and he told them that the best equipment was reserved for the villages or town militia. So maybe the characters could try to talk with the mayor, convince him of giving some pieces of armor and better equipment in exchange for protecting town, carrying out some sort of quest, or maybe convincing the mayor that in that tower there was some sort of threat building up, and maybe a small force, anything that was hunting the tower, maybe like a force of imps or undead or anything that you can think of was going to come out of the tower and attack the town or cause some trouble for those that were moving around the town collecting fruits and vegetables or whatnot. So the characters started to think of what they could do. Maybe there weren't magical items available either, or maybe potions. They needed potions, and not a single non-player character in town knew how to create potions. Maybe they needed to look for some sort of witch or sorcerer, or a cleric that is sort of like a hermit in the forest, or a druid that could create potions for the town. So they need to go there, and that could be a quest by itself. And so they got things for town. Maybe a potion maker decided to stay in town and open up a business, or maybe it was a red herring or a false rumor, and the cottage or anything in the forest that supposedly had this witch or this sorcerer or cleric that create some magical potions, healing potions or protection potions, etc. He or she was they were already dead, but they could find the scrolls or books on how to create magical items and potions, etc. So as you can see, it develops quite a bit just by having that lack of gear, of weapons, of armor, of magical items, potions. You can build so many adventures around that. So now the simple quest of going to the Mage Tower, that could have been a very short, perhaps forgettable adventure, now becomes in somewhat of an odyssey, trying to find some way to gear up first before taking on the tower, and you still give the player characters the choice of if they want to challenge the tower without getting the best equipment available or potentially available. They could do that as well, and Final Fantasy XI got me thinking about that. But now let's talk about some other thing. Let's talk about one more thing that's also a good excuse for a quest. Sometimes maybe there's a shortage of metal in town. They could also search for caverns or mines around the area that they could inform the mayor about them, so that they started to begin a sort of like an enterprise to create the town or village turn into a mining town of sorts, and that way the characters perhaps could be rewarded by the mayor, and they could also get the armor that they were looking for. And now let's move on to the other way in which Final Fantasy XI influenced my style of running role-playing games. I think this is very important when it comes to my development as a dungeon master or game master. In Final Fantasy XI, there are so many deadly places that it's completely suicidal to travel alone, even when your character is at the same level of a particular monster or beast that roams around that area. Those monsters are simply not made for your character to take them on your own. Even if you're at a somewhat decent level, even if you're, let's say, level 10 or something, and the enemy is also level 10, you're going to get killed if you solo that enemy. You need a group. Perhaps you could stand a bit of a chance if you had only like magical or the best equipment available, and you would still end up quite wounded after perhaps fighting a goblin. That's how powerful enemies are in Final Fantasy XI. Goblins were quite deadly, so your character could win the fight, but with very little hit points left, and maybe another enemy ambushes you and kills you, even if, because there is no safe. There are very few places where you can rest for a bit in the different zones of Final Fantasy XI. There's always that possibility of another enemy attacking you from behind or ambushing you. Entire groups have died when they decided to choose a wrong spot to rest and recover. So I remember the first time that I completed all of my quests, at least those quests appropriate to the lower levels, near Sandoria and around Sandoria. It was this big forested area, and it was relatively safe because you could solo most of the enemies there as long as they were more or less at your level. And if you had problems, there were a lot of players moving through that area. Sometimes you would get rescued by higher level players, or even players of the same level as you. And there were also a lot of just really high level players that were entering and coming and going through Sandoria. So it was relatively easy to take a chance and fight a monster on your own. But I really wanted to go to other places, see more of the game. So I decided to go into Lathain Plateau, if I'm not mistaken. It's a huge area with a lot of like slopes and small mountains. But what I really love about that place, I think the song was quite moody, not in the sense that it was creepy, but it was had some sort of like mysticism to it. And in nighttime, it felt really awesome, dark, mysterious. And at the center of that zone, there was this huge. I don't remember the name of the structure exactly. I think they were called cracks, and they were basically they looked like a combination of a white semi-organic UFO with a castle. It was mysterious. You didn't know exactly what they were or why were they there, who created those structures, or if they somehow just appeared out of nowhere. The original purpose of them. Later on, in one of the expansions, they explain a bit more about the ancients that built those things. But in vanilla Final Fantasy XI, when it first started, and they served to teleport people around. You had some platforms around those structures, and you needed a mage to teleport you using those platforms. But they were always so mysterious to me. I kept thinking, can you actually go into those places? Why are those things there? And remember, because this was the beginning of Final Fantasy XI, a lot of people didn't know much about the lore, about the purpose of many things in the game. So it was so mysterious, and even if you asked around, nobody knew exactly why those things were there. And it was while I was moving through that the thin plateau that I got into a fight. I think it was against a goblin, and goblins were really annoying. You could get into fights with some deadly hares or rabbits. I remember they were kind of like bunny looking monsters, and the goblins and some like monstrous shape of swords, if I'm not mistaken. And I was fighting against this goblin, and they have this really annoying attack in which they hurt everyone around them before dying. If you do not kill them quickly, they could damage you quite a bit, or kill you using their bombs. But I remember that I was almost about to die, and I was like, oh no, I'm not going to get my attack out there in time, because your attacks in Final Fantasy XI, you have no control over them in the rate of the way that you are attacking. You always attack at a set pace, like you hit, and then you hit, and then you hit again. Even if you are like really fast with like a button masher, it has no effect on your attacks. So I was just about to get killed by that goblin, and another player passed by and saw me, and he cast a spell and managed to kill the goblin before that. So I was really grateful, and that became my my first Final Fantasy XI buddy in that we partied together and such. Because it was so terrifying when you moved through the thin plateau. There were so many dangers, and there were, because I was telling you, there was these like slopes and precipices and falls. If you were not careful, maybe you took a wrong step, and your character would slide down, and you ended up in a place that you needed to make a really long turn to get back to where you were. And down there where you fell down, there were a lot of monsters, goblins that were stealing in those ships, and rabbits, and you knew that if one of those aggroed you, that if it got you in sight and went after you, it was going to chase you, and you were so far away from the zone area, that is where you could change zones to a point that the enemies could not follow you. It was almost like a death sentence. And in Final Fantasy XI, if you get killed, you lose a lot of experience points. That means you would lose hours of gameplay. The time that you spent was so precious, so it was terrifying. There was actually somewhat, not, I won't say famous, but well-known player in my server. I don't remember the name of the server, but he basically was a magnet for enemies. He was the type of guy, and I remember the name of the player character, but I'm not going to say it because I don't. Maybe he's someone that other people know, and he doesn't want people to know about his Final Fantasy XI past. but I remember his name correctly because it was so common of him of getting groups killed because of his careless and clumsy way of playing. He was not a jerk. He wasn't a bad person, but he was so terrible at trying to sneak by certain areas. And so he basically was completely oblivious to his surroundings. He was the type of guy who constantly fall down slopes when you were all ready and we were all had like a healthy group and had a good thing going, moving from one place to another or camping and leveling up. He will always fall down someplace, and sometimes he got this I would say like a mania that he wanted to attack everything, and he was not trolling. He seemed like he had a short attention span or something, so it was quite hilarious. It wasn't really not that annoying because it was so funny how he kept doing all of those things, and nobody even like laughed at him like, oh, you're so such an idiot or something. It was just everybody was like just chuckling on the inside, but he kept doing all of that, and sometimes he got everyone killed. And I remember one time I wasn't even playing with him, and he sent me a message, and he was like, "I'm sorry about last time," and I was like, "When I aggroed that couple of monsters and they killed the mage and all of that," and I was like, "Well, I thought it was quite hilarious. I guess the mage was quite bothered by that or annoyed, but." But I found it quite funny. He was just a magnet for monsters. And so if you wanted to get from one place to another, sneaking by, avoiding the most dangerous monsters, it was not a good idea to include him in the group. It was better to move on your own, and then when you reach that area, you send him a message that he could get there. And that's the funny thing, when he actually moved on his own, most of the time he was capable of getting through an area without getting killed or attacking other monsters. Not always, but it was better than with a group. Maybe he got nervous being in a group. Maybe that's it. So in Final Fantasy XI we had all of those incredible moments just getting from one place to another. That's why I said that it taught me a lot about that when playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because in the box set they just skip from one adventure site to the other. I'm missing out on all of those encounters. I also love that how in Final Fantasy XI at night some of the most deadliest creatures would appear. They were so terrifying, but because a lot of them could kill you in just one hit. And in the dunes there were these, I don't remember how they were called. I think they were called wraiths. They look like your typical skeleton with a sword and a shield, just straight out of the Argonauts movie. It seemed such an unremarkable enemy, so weak, but it could kill you in just one hit, and it appeared only at night. So in the dunes, there were many camping spots where you took your group and you stayed there while one of the party members pulled an enemy, and you ganged up on that enemy. You killed it. You gain experience points, and rinse and repeat. Pull enemies, kill them. Pull enemies, kill them. That's how you started to level up. If it weren't for the social aspect, it would be quite boring. But that was the most enjoyable thing about Final Fantasy XI, even though it was constant grind fest, so repetitive, pulling and killing. You started to talk with the other players, you got to know them, you joked, you laughed. Sometimes they shared, you heard their problems or their troubles. Sometimes you offered some solutions that is in real life they had some problems and issues, and sometimes you even supported each other. But there was this time where we got to the beach area, the Valkyrie Dunes, and all of the best camping spots where the monsters would spawn constantly is somewhat weak monsters. And remember, weak means that you need an entire group to kill them. The camping spots were taken, so there was this spot near the sort of like the remains of a ship, and nobody wanted to take that spot. That was the only spot available because it was around that spot where this skeleton appeared at night. So we decided to take a risk. I was always at the position of leader in the parties, so it was my decision. I said, let's take a chance. We'll just move the camp when night comes. So we started. We set up camp there near the ruined ship. It was somewhat far away from the water, from the main beach area, so I don't know how that ship got there. So it was an airship, perhaps. In Final Fantasy there are airships. So we started to fight, and suddenly we started to take a bit of time with this giant flying fish. There was these like brown orangey fish things that you could pull. They were usually close to the water, and sometimes the monsters, because there were so many camps of other parties around you pulling monsters, sometimes it was quite difficult to get a monster. So in this case, the guy that was pulling, I don't remember if it was a thief or a ranger. They had the idea to go all the way to the water area, and I was getting a bit worried because I was thinking, oh no, it's almost nighttime, I hope he doesn't take too much time. But he managed to pull one of these fish monsters. It came flying. Just imagine like a killer fish, sort of like a piranha of sorts. It's quite big, and that it doesn't swim in the water, it moves through the air. So it pulled it up to us, pulled the thing, and we started fighting. And we started to take too much time in killing it, and it was like, oh no, I'm so nervous, it's going to be nighttime. And when they actually we delivered the 2 or 3 blows to kill the thing, we were all like, yes, now let's, and I said, okay everyone, let's move the camp. But I noticed that everybody was already running away. I was the only one in the spot. I don't know, like in the blink of an eye, everybody just started to run away. Not only our group, but also surrounding groups, because undead are just so dangerous, because they, unless you have a paladin, they were so annoying to fight. They take a lot of hits, they deal a lot of damage, and they give little experience. They're more trouble, and they're not worth it. And I could tell what was going to happen, so I moved the camera around a bit, and yes, it was the skeleton moving towards my character. I think it killed me in 2 blows. So it was terrible. So terrible. I remember another area. I think it was a glacier area. It was this place with a lot of frozen zones and snow, and mountains and rocks, and you felt so unprotected there. That was probably my least favorite area, because it was so risky. You only had like this small entrance section in which everybody was just like huddled there. It looked somewhat funny because it was so cold and everybody was looking for a group huddled together. It looked like a bunch of people that were freezing to death and were looking for a group. And when you actually found a group, you had to go into these open areas. It had like a tundra feel to it. And there were these enemies, the Gygas. They're basically giants, but they look somewhat like zombie giants. They have this sickly green color, and you could see some of their ribs, not through the skin, but you could see their ribs through their skin, and they were still quite muscular. And they had all these zombie-like faces with teeth exposing their gums. They were quite difficult to kill. They also threw rocks at you, if I remember correctly. And there were also some zones where there were these ghost things that appeared and they could kill you quite easily. If I'm not mistaken, some of them could actually curse you. It was annoying to remove a curse. You needed a white mage. So that all of those dangers stuck with me. I started to take those experiences and use them in my Advanced Dungeons and Dragons games. And this is quite common for those of you that are experienced in sandbox type of running a session, as I said before, because each hex in the map could hold one or more encounters. So every time my players moved from one hex to the other and there was an encounter of sorts, I remembered, oh, I felt so fascinated when I first got to the 10th plateau and I saw this mysterious white structure. So I included some runes that had no clue as to their purpose whatsoever. The player characters only had they could see some glyphs or markings, and it was only later on in the campaign where they identified a particular symbol or rune associated with that structure, and they would go back to that structure and realize that it was some sort of way to going into the structure. And otherwise it could be anything else. They could have seen some strange markings in the sand if they were moving through a desert. Those markings sometimes appeared on their own, like the wind traced those marks, and they were also quite curious about those things. And so anything that they could encounter in different hexes, it served for further adventures. Maybe they could return to that area or zone later on and discover the true purpose or the thing hidden behind that. Because in Final Fantasy XI there were so many structures and vehicles, abandoned places, ruins, castles that you simply didn't know why they were there, and only later on through questing and talking to non-player characters and perhaps using the internet, you start to understand why those places were there. And when it comes to the dangers of moving from one place to the other, I think the most influential part of Final Fantasy XI for me, at least at the beginning, was when I first had to move to Juno. Juno is it's a big city. It's the next step for you to become a proper adventurer, because if you want to have an advanced sub-job like a Dark Knight, Paladin, Summoner, you needed to go to Juno. It was related to the quest, things that you could do, and some items necessary for each quest, because it was different for each job or class. And to get to Juno, you had to go through 2 or 3 areas that were really above your level. It was for someone who is comfortable in games that hold your hand and take you progressively through different zones. It sounded preposterous to move through those areas, because there was no way for you to defeat those enemies. Even an entire group could get killed by fighting a single enemy in those places. In a swamp area, there are a lot of Malboros. You may remember Malboros from other Final Fantasy games. They're basically like monstrous carnivorous plants with many eyes and tentacles, and they shoot out this smoke that poisons you. So they were deadly, and there were so many areas in which the Malboros were moving around, and you needed to wait for the Malboro to pass by, and you could go there through that area. But sometimes the Malboro were somewhat whimsical. You couldn't predict their patterns, so maybe you thought that the Malboro was passing by, and you moved, and it decided to turn around and it attacked you, and that was it. There were many sections in zones like that with powerful enemies that you could not predict their movements. It felt like a gamble to go through that area. So you either needed to have a friend of like 10 levels above yours, or more preferably, to escort you through that place, or you could do it like I did with my other friend that we were always partying together. Both of us managed to sneak by the entire 3 sections, and it was such a jarring adrenaline rush type of experience, because you could die so easily. It was only later on that you could get your hands on the Chocobo, the mount of Final Fantasy, that like yellow, huge, big chicken that you could ride. But it was so so worrisome, so scary to go through those zones. And in my Advanced Dungeons and Dragons games, I always include in the overland travel some small chance of encountering a beast that is just too much against your the party members. I even experimented in a short-lived campaign, having the Tarask moving around certain zones, and it was a really aggressive Tarasque that since spotted the player characters, they had to do their best to either escape or hide from that monster, and there was a pretty good chance that they would get killed if they didn't take the right choice almost immediately. It was one of those moments that quickly, what do you do? And if they were like, oh well, and the Taras got to them and they started to attack them, and so I think that adds a lot of excitement to the game because the player characters could die at any moment. So I just wanted to share those memories and thoughts on how Final Fantasy XI influenced my style of running RPGs in those couple of subtle but important ways, because it really got me to appreciate, to get a better sense of how to put a bit more excitement in what would otherwise be a mundane adventure or your typical or average adventure. And so now the player characters need to look for that place to get better gear, or now when they move from one adventure site to the other, or between towns and cities, they know that anything could happen in the wilderness. So that's basically it. Thanks for watching this video. If you have other maybe you have also been influenced by video games or other games, maybe board games, or maybe situations in real life, of course, that have inspired you to add some things to your RPG sessions, either as a game master or as a player character. Maybe you created a character based on some things that you experienced in video games, board games, or in real life, etc. So I hope you will share your experiences in the comment section, or maybe make a video response, or whatever you like. And if you have some other comments or questions, please let me know. And once again, thanks, and see you later.